As you move through the center, the COO, or the Chief Operating Officer, and the business unit leaders, they're the ones that are rolling their sleeves up, and they are leading the operations. They're executing on the strategy. So you understand that that oversight and the governance, who is accountable for it, they're driving the value shift. Now, I'm really breaking these two down, but they are in essence one and the same. And I'll just quickly outline what these acronyms mean. CRO, Chief Risk Officer, not everyone has it. I understand that. CDO, Chief Development Officer. Again, not every organization has one, but the person that's in charge of moving business initiatives forward. The CSO, again, Chief Strategy Officer, not every organization has one, but that's the one that sets long-term strategic direction. I'm not talking about getting around in a retreat and talking about developing high-level strategy. This is the dedicated strategy function. In essence, what I'm seeing is that these roles are really often done by either an offshoot of the CFO or an offshoot of the General Counsel. What is really the consistent thread here? It centers around risk. But more importantly, it's not focused on the downside. It's looking at risk from upside and the downside. So it's really saying there's an uncertain factor around risk and risk management. There's an element of risk that could hurt the organization, the downside on the left. But there's an element of risk that's on the right-hand side, driving value. Are we optimizing the risk that you know, as Hein mentioned, the known and unknown aspects, and are we capitalizing on the potential upside from being aware of the risk and how well you're controlling it? So if you think about that, don't use the word risk. Use the word it's uncertain. Therefore, it could fall on either end of the spectrum. Any comments, Hein?
No, not so far, thanks.
Okay. Now, any questions for the audience before I introduce this kind of fancy concept of the resilient organization? It's really not that fancy after all. It really, I will walk you through this. Yes, I understand it's small print for the back, so I apologize in advance. If you look at this chart, this is an actual output that has been designed for one of the leading conglomerate companies in the world. What it does, it breaks down from the board perspective the two aspects. There's the management of the risk, and then there's the oversight of the risk. Both have to be working in tandem in order to achieve what is called a resilient organization. One that can bounce back from negative events, downturn, one that can capitalize on that and really optimize the organization in the event of a buoyant time. The true definition of resiliency. So, if we look at the board in the middle, obviously I'll walk you through this. Chief Executive Officer, underneath the board. The board oversees audit and risk issues. The CEO oversees risk responsibilities. Again, we're looking at this from a risk and uncertainty perspective. As you follow through the fundamental aspect of the organization, you have the CFO. They assist the CEO in risk responsibilities. And then you have the business units down here, much more granular, but they're actually in the weeds doing all of the work. Okay, now, as we look at the two purple boxes, really, I'm not oversimplifying it. It really is the fact of the matter. There's a management of risk. There's the oversight. On the management side, this is typically where the board's risk committee, if you have one. Quick show of hands to everyone in the room. Do you have a formal risk committee right now? So, just a small number of them. Okay. Well, in essence, I'll just give you a couple of best practices here. The committee, centered around risk, obviously talks about the strategies, the tolerances. This is really where they get into the materiality review of the organization, but from an oversight point of view. And in this case, the person that's in charge of the risk office, they're the ones that are actually turning the governance best practices from the risk committee into reality. Very high-level summary of the management side of the risk. Now, in the oversight, very clear. Audit committee, show of hands. Who has an audit committee? Better see a lot of hands here. All right. much more clearly defined, much more easy to understand. This is a clear example that, do some of you believe the board should be involved in managing risk? Not sure. By show of hands, it doesn't seem that way. The majority of you understand that there is the oversight function. It's very clear by definition of the fact you have an audit committee. Now, also through that, they're responsible for internal controls. So there's a tie back to the audit executive, internal, external auditors, and the audit committee is definitely a very well-defined tool in the board of directors toolbox. No question about that. Then finally, we've got the management risk committee, made up of management cross-functional business leaders. Quick show of hands here. Who has a cross-functional committee made up of management, operational and strategic executive management, that gets together on a regular basis? Interesting. Okay.
You know, this is very interesting. I suspect you might be the person who stuck her hand up. Are you with a financial institution by chance? I thought that might be so. For obvious reasons, the consciousness of the need to identify risk is most alive in the financial institutions that are regulated federally and provincially by regulators who themselves, having just had some really narrow escapes, are really alive to how dangerous it is not to have your eye on the risk ball. It's always dangerous to predict what judges are going to do, but my guess is that that consciousness is going to bleed out into the balance of the world, particularly of publicly traded companies. And so boards that don't at least pay attention to should you or should you not have a risk committee, and if they choose not to have a risk committee, leave behind a trail of persuasive reasons why they chose to dispense with it. Boards who do not do that, I think, are running some risk.
Can I just, I challenge that assumption, right? Just because you don't have a board risk committee doesn't mean that your board is not managing risk. It's about how the actual process that you want. There is a school of thought that that is actually the core duty of the board, actually, is to manage risk, because it's inherent in oversight of strategy, and that you shouldn't actually somehow delegate it to a committee such as an audit committee or governance committee, because it's so fundamental to what the board should be doing. I think that obviously, in my mind, the board should obviously be managing risk. That's part of their duty. But whether you choose to do it through a risk committee is something very much around how you want to effectively run the board and the time that you spend and the expertise that you have on the board.
Absolutely. I agree completely, but putting my lawyerly hat on for a moment, when you come to explain to a judge what you did and why you did it, it is great to have some visible symbols of the activity set. So stepping over to a different context, the context of a takeover, where the board, for reasons I'll come to, is or should be really keen to have access to the business judgment rule. There are relatively elaborate ceremonies that you go through to demonstrate to a judge, if it ever goes before a judge, that you did what you were supposed to do. And so there's different ways of skinning the cat. Maybe risk is regularly a subject on the agenda. Maybe risk is a tab in the board book for every meeting. I agree there's other ways of skinning the cat, but absent evidence that the board turned its mind to the issue on a regular basis and dealt with it, I think you might be taking a walk on the wild side.
Well, no, I agree with that entirely, but you can have a risk committee that actually doesn't have any evidence of actually addressing risk. You could also have a board with no risk committee that is routine, so it's going to be based on how the actual facts play out in terms of what is the board really doing.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Michael?
Perfect. Actually, in sort of support of that, I think the next two slides will give you a better hopefully a little more of a less definitive box. Because you're absolutely right. The board, one of their fundamental questions that they ask is, are we on top of the risks? What are they? How you go about doing that, it varies. What I'm going to walk you through in the next 2 slides is really the conceptual play of how this actually looks. Again, looking at it from the management of risk perspective and the oversight of risk. This is an example of the management of risk, being in a position to drive risk management behaviors. This is really looking at the boards and the committees at the center, I'll take a liberty here, at the center of attention. You're basically building this out. A couple of things to note here. You're influencing or you're providing guidance on such things as delegations of authority, helping to set the bars in terms of what those levels are. Policies and procedures, people and values. These are really the techniques that you can be using to really provide that insight for you to provide the management direction. The control activities, risk assessments, those are, to your point, they should be what you're asking the questions on an ongoing basis anyways. But the question is, what do they look like? Is it a formal risk assessment that's underway? Who's involved? How often is it done? And frankly, what are you actually assessing? Are you assessing operational risk? If you're a financial institution, that's your bailiwick. You need to focus on that. But if you're broader, if you're a utility company, if you're a mining organization, there's a much bigger profile that you need to be thinking about. It goes back to one of my earlier concepts of materiality, because that leads into how much control do we need to be aware of? What are the activities? Again, looking from the inside out, you're managing. Outer rings, strategic planning, performance management, absolutely part and parcel in terms of driving the organization forward. And how is this all kept in line? Working in tandem with the internal audit function, which again is just a big picture look at, on the left-hand side of the resilient organization, the management of risk perspective. Any questions on that before I do a contrast? Yes?
I've been on a number of different boards. I've been on boards where strictly oversight. And I've also been on boards where they actually get involved and they actually go through with management the strategic planning process. And they're actually right in there, you know, and more so on not-for-profit boards and what have you, but I've seen that. But I've even heard that even, you know, for-profit organizations have had that. So you have the Carver model, you have these different types of board governance. What if you have a board that's just oversight versus one that's much more involved? What are the inherent risks, and how can you mitigate that risk?
I can do another entire session on that entire question. Fundamentally, you're asking, to your point as well in the back, about how deep do we actually have to have a committee? If we do, what are we talking about with respect to the types of risks that we're profiling, the types of dialogues we're having on a regular basis? Are you actually stepping into the role of risk management? That, again, is a conversation that we can have that, for the purposes of keeping this morning moving, I'll just basically say both options represent risks to a board member. One, if you're not careful about setting the right parameters, in this example, you could be essentially stepping in to be interpreted as an employee of the organization. That unto itself puts you at a completely different liability realm. And Hein can elaborate a bit more on that. If you're purely on the oversight side, that represents something. Are you doing enough? We're not sure. The oversight on this piece is looking from the outside in. Are you simply doing a superficial touch on risk management? Are you simply taking in information? Are you not asking the hard questions about the management philosophy, the operating style, the organizational structure, and the values? So it's really a question of doing a current state understanding of what your organization is set up to do with respect to the, shall we say, the risk philosophy. And if you're a large organization or a small, you need to start setting parameters and live to that, as Hein can sort of elaborate in terms of setting the bar.
My sense of it is again, collapsing a large subject into a small compass. If you're going to be make attentive your fingers and listen to what you're told kind of a board, make sure that what you're told is pretty broad and sweeping, so that if someone is critical of you ultimately, you can say, I had this, I had this, I had this, I had this, what more should I have done? I was supplied with plenty of information. If you're going to be, we're going to go in there and be part of the process board, I'd be careful of two things. One is to describe the outer boundaries of what you're going to do, because whatever you describe, you're likely to be held to it, so don't push them out too far. And the second is, be careful about the standard you set yourself, because whatever the standard you set yourself, you'll be held to a standard that will be the higher of what a judge would think and that which you set yourself. So don't go too high.
Okay, hope that answers your question there. Now, actually, one of the other things to think about is not only the organizational sort of structure of what that looks like and the role that you play. This is really a much clearer kind of interplay of what Hein mentioned. Where the board and the governance function, where it actually sits in tandem with the management functions. Looking at it from the perspective of outside non-executive directors, you clearly are in the blue, and you clearly, in this example, you're somewhat at arm's length from the day-to-day management of the company. In the red, at the very bottom, these are managers, this is the operations, these are functional department heads, these are people that manage the organization. But they're sort of separate and distinct from the governance function. What we're looking at there are the little boxes within the red that's overlapping into the blue. This is really your, shall we say, your light at the end of the tunnel. Those are the people you should be looking for. The executive officers, the senior management that has a seat on the board, as well as have hands-on participation in the management of the company. So, one example with respect to the overall governance structure, by way of looking at executive directors, management, who are not part of the director office, and then basically, where does this overlap? It's all part of understanding the way your organization is currently set up, so you can begin to start taking away some of the concepts we're sharing with you and tailor it to your own organization. Any questions with respect to this? Just want to close out with a couple of comments here on the core values. And again, you may in fact have your own value statements with respect to what the board abides by, how you make decisions, what formulates your thought process when you actually go to forming an opinion and a statement about an issue that you're faced with. 4 fundamental things to think about. There's fairness, responsibility, accountability, and transparency. Do these resonate with everyone in the room? Quick show of hands. I'd be shocked if that it didn't, but I'm glad that it did, though. Okay, so we won't go into too much detail here, but again, what's important, and again to reiterate what Hein is saying, is that set some standards, but be able to defend what those standards are and where they came from. Because if you can't, then I'm not going to speak on behalf of what a litigator would do, but there's an opportunity for them to poke holes through that without question. Any questions on this entire section? I'll hand this over to Hein to kind of walk you through a little more detail from the legal perspective.
I want to focus in on just a couple of areas. We really covered a bunch of this. Traditional role, making attentive your fingers. The emerging role, having to monitor and ensure and do stuff like that. The 3 groups to whom you might have liability ultimately. And then the safe harbors, and I didn't explain the safe harbors. I'd like to do 2 things. One, talk about the duty of loyalty to the company and the duty of care to the company, because that second one can morph into a duty of care to the shareholders. So that's subject number 1. Subject number 2 is the safe harbors. I want to flesh that out just a little more. Begin with the duty of loyalty. And The story I will tell you is real. It went to the House of Lords, then England's highest court. And it's called Regal Hastings and Gulliver. And Regal Hastings was a cinema. And it had done well. They had some spare cash to invest. They looked to buy a second cinema. But the company only had the money for half. And so the directors, good guys that they were, said, okay, we'll pony up the other half. And so it came to pass that Regal Hastings had a sub of which they owned 50%, and the directors owned the other 50%. Along comes a buyer who buys all of it, the shares of the parent and the shares of the sub that the parent didn't own. And once that deal had closed, the buyer, using the Regal Hastings name, said, you, the directors, have made big profits on the second cinema. You need to give them back, because you owed a duty of loyalty. You were fiduciaries. You were not entitled to profit from a corporate opportunity. And they prevailed, because directors may not permit themselves to come into a position where their interest, making a profit on the investment, comes into conflict with their duty to the company to maximize profit for the company. But you say, and they said, the company didn't have the money. And the answer is, if we permitted fiduciaries to take that position, then their beneficiaries would not be safe. And that was the end of that. So the duty of loyalty is one which, if it applies, can really, really sting, because it turns into an option. You make the investment. If it fails, you lost your capital. If it wins, you hand the profits off. So focusing on the avoidance of the duty of loyalty is not crazy. Let me then come to the duty of care. The duty of care is just the duty not to mess up, the duty to do a good job, the same duty that your bicycle repairman owes. This story is called Smith and Van Gorkum. It's a Delaware story. Van Gorkum had a wonderful, celebrated career, ended up his last 18 years as CEO of a successful company, publicly traded. But it was his time to go retire. So he went to see his pal, Jay Pritzker. And Jay Pritzker is of the Pritzker clan that built the Hyatt chain. That's one Pritzker brother. Jay built the Marmon company, which was an industrial, actually not so many, an industrial conglomerate. I think in the end when it was sold for $6 billion or something. So it was a decent-sized company. Van Gorkum sold the company to Pritzker at a 60% premium to the market, $55 a share. How did he get to 55? He figured out what the biggest price was that a levered buyout artist could pay based on the company's cash flow, and that's how he set it. So he goes to his board, $55, good deal, let's do it. And they closed. By then, in the US, not yet in Canada, the class action fraternity was active, and so class action was brought by some shareholder who held, I suspect, 150 shares or something like that against the board. And the allegation against the board was, you should have looked out to make sure that the price was right. All we know is that that's what some, according to the CEO anyway, it's what some levered buyout artist would pay. How do we know that you can't get more? And that claim failed initially, went to the Delaware Supreme Court, where it prevailed. So then, having won on liability but not yet assessed damages, the claim went back to the trial court. And while it was pending there, with the sole issue being how much were the directors personally required to pay, it settled. And it settled for $23.5 million. The policy limits under the D&O policy were 10. So that left 13.5 for the directors personally. And then, charmingly, Jay Pritzker stepped in and said he thought the judgment was wrong, and he wrote a check for the balance. So the directors, in the end, after some years of what must have been agony, got off the financial hook, but still had years of brain damage to show for it. And so the short version of that story is that the duty of care, if you violate it, and if either the company changes hands or it morphs into a duty to the shareholders because there is a purchase of the company, it can really, really bite. Which brings us to safe harbors. As to the duty of loyalty, all of the company acts have a ceremony in them. You got to close your eyes, turn around 3 times, touch your nose. It's really not much more than that. And typically, the ceremony is you have to make a clean breast of things to the board. And the astonishing thing to a lawyer is it has become a trap for the unwary. There's lots of situations where a board could have done that, Regal, Hastings, and Gulliver being one example where they could have done it, but they don't, with unattractive consequences. The second is the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule plays typically in takeover situations, and the reason it's worth a little bit of emphasis is because that is where directors personally run the Smith and Van Gorkum type risk. And what the business judgment rule says is that if you go through a process that is conducted, that is driven by people who have no interest in the transaction other than shareholders or directors, then the court will say, we're not going to second guess you on the basis of were you right or were you wrong. The question we're going to ask is what you did within some zone of reasonableness? And if it was, it's the end of it. Not going to second guess it. So what happens, and this goes back to the ceremonies that we create to create a record that the business judgment rule should be available. When there's a takeover bid, the target company will set up a special committee. The special committee will have no one who has an interest other than as a shareholder in the transaction. It'll have a financial advisor. It'll have a legal advisor. The special committee will come to a conclusion and will actually actively mix into the negotiation, usually. And then at the end, it makes a recommendation, not binding, of course, but you'll be unsurprised to hear almost unfailingly, the board as a whole unanimously will adopt whatever the special committee comes back with. And if you do that, you've really cauterized the Smith and Van Gorkum risk. Michael?
Perfect. Okay, so we've covered the map, we've covered the route. Now we're almost there. So before we kind of get into some of the sort of summation topics here, what are we getting out of this so far? A couple of comments. I'm seeing nodding of heads. We've touched on a few chords. What do you think?
It's all very appropriate to a lot of our business activities, so I'm finding it really engaging and enjoying all the comments.
Okay. Comments from the back. Have we missed something? Have we touched on a few things for you? So far, so good. Over here. What are your thoughts?
What's helping me most is this circle where you connect the KPIs and KRIs. I think that will help me with my audit committee. Thank you.
Perfect. We can definitely have a discussion. Being a corporate strategist by trade, I can definitely talk to you at length about the integration of what that actual case was all about. For sure. Comments over here with respect to a couple of topics that are important. I understand this whole management and oversight, for sure. Any other comments from here in terms of the topic? So far, so good. All right.
Michael, I have a comment.
Yes.
It might be directed towards Hein. You started the discussion about how the law has shifted over the 100 years, that boards, they can't just ignore their responsibilities. But then there's also, you mentioned several times, don't set the standard too high. Be careful, board, of setting a standard too high and then being trapped by that. So where is that optimal balance? And what are the tools available to board members to ensure that they've got that right, that optimal level of, that they've addressed it, that they haven't ignored the law, but haven't set the standard too high for themselves?
Well, go first and I'll respond. So.
At least from a legal perspective, I don't think there is a sort of blinding flash of insight answer to that question. I think it's a detailed answer depending on each of the activities you're talking about, which will differ depending on what the company does for a living. So I don't think I can take it further.
Sure. I'm going to add a little color to that because that is actually a comment and a question that's often asked when I'm asked to speak to boards. And it's really centered around, and I glossed over those topics at the very beginning intentionally because this was not a concept of drilling deep into the sort of enterprise risk issues. But there are two issues, materiality and this sort of ongoing debate between risk appetite and risk tolerance. So these sort of levels of assumption and pass-through of risks that your organization should be taking. But what's more important is actually looking at, if you go way back to the beginning, the map defines your materiality. So what is your risk profile? What industry are you in? What do your competitors look like? As you begin to set that bar, you need to really start thinking about, well, really, do we want to be like, if I'm in a mining company, do I want to be like a Gold Corp? Or do I want to simply be within the junior mining sector because those are my peers? The bar is beginning to be set for you. So you begin to have conversations at the board level about what is materiality? How is that defined within your organization? Do you have a formal risk appetite statement? It may not be a financial one. It could be something more qualitative. It could be a percentage of your earnings per share. Questions like that that need to be asked and defined help you set that bar. Now, as Hein mentioned, is that all defensible in court? I'm not the lawyer, but I can tell you that by actually going through the conversation, you're educating yourself when you make decisions as a director. You're aware that if your organization, your senior management says, you know what, we have unlimited liability. We're a risk-taking organization. We're in the mining sector. We take risks all the time. Well, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. I would say, define that for me, and better yet, give me the evidence as to where you came up with that. That's how you begin to set the bar. Now, the bar is going to vary depending on the industry, depending on who you are as a director. But again, think of these concepts as the sort of rolling stock. You need to be thinking about materiality, risk appetite, risk tolerance, but it's all rolled up into what is the organization that you are in the best interest making decisions for. Hope that answers the question. Okay, now as we get into this part, the destination, we're going to talk a bit about the top trends and the case study towards the end here, because I think we're still good on time. But what I want to begin with is really bringing the two concepts together by talking about this sort of relatively emerging concept of risk governance. And I want to draw the parallel between corporate governance, as everybody in this room is familiar with. Well, actually, let me ask the question. Formal definition of corporate governance, is that formally defined within your organization? Tough question. It's defined in many different places, and I'm sure as a director, you have some level of guidance of what corporate governance really means. The emergence of this concept of a risk governance philosophy is something that is relatively new, but let me draw you the quickest and easiest application of what this means. You begin with the value of the enterprise. If you remember one of the graphics I showed you, it had that sort of blue hill. Shifting the blue hill from one side to the other, that's really enhancing and influencing the value of the enterprise. In support of that is this view to risk management. I'm not talking about the functionary role of risk management, but the awareness and the education you have of the material risks. What is the organization currently doing about it, and how effective, and are you applying a corrective action at a high level That's what I'm talking about, the application of risk management in support to drive the value of the enterprise. Now, here's where the two come together. Corporate governance, typically what you deal with in your capacity as a board member. You're obviously looking at the value of the enterprise. You're very high level, you're looking at the organization as a whole, and you're basically applying a decision-making process to enhance and drive value. Now, this emerging topic, the risk governance piece, takes into account more formalities around risk management. By definition, what are we talking about here? Corporate governance, structures and processes for the direction and the control of the company. You can define that in many different ways. I picked one that was easy and it fit on the slide nicely. So, risk governance, what does that really mean? These are the ways in which directors authorize, optimize, and monitor risk taking within the organization. So if you think about, to the commentary that we had about oversight versus management, this is another way to essentially look at the application of corporate governance from a risk perspective, looking at the ways risks are being optimized. Notice I'm not saying mitigated purely, because some risks can actually be capitalized on. And again, you set the bar by saying it's uncertain. We don't know, is it going to present a downside or is it going to present an upside? That is really all centered around the concept of risk governance. And this is all thank you to the International Finance Corporation. It's another kind of association that I participate with. This is, again, a very somewhat new topic, but I do encourage you to think about how that could work within your organization if it doesn't already exist as a formal sort of board discussion item. Now, finally, you'll find them a big fan of graphics. And the reason that's important is because I deal with a lot of directors as well. They don't like a lot of, don't waste my time, basically. Give me something that speaks to me, that actually makes sense, that you can take back and you can remember something from it. Takeaways for this particular issue is what I've created that's called the governance pyramid. Very simple. I'll break it down for you. Begin at the top of the pyramid. I put ERM simply because the formal words of enterprise risk management, strategic risk management, again, not thinking at the granular functionary level, we're talking about the broad application of risk management, is truly what is at the pinnacle of good corporate governance. As a result of that, development of corporate policies and procedures, those are obviously your sort of, the headlights are there for you. It's that insight you have as a result of understanding the risk to the organization. You develop policies and procedures to help you stay on top of them. So that's sort of in the middle. That's the more fluid piece. And at the foundation of this, definitely the fallback is on the executive risk insurance side. Why this is important with respect to the governance pyramid, we're going to go on the left-hand side. The return on your investment as a director is maximized at the top of this pyramid. Sure, you can buy insurance to protect yourself. I'm sure you want to find better ways to take control of that, to take control of the personal liability that Hein has reinforced. So the return, if you kind of move up the pyramid, actually gets higher for you if you're an advocate to encourage more proactive and more strategic risk management approaches. As we go along the downside, in tandem with that, you lose control from the point of view of staying on top of your own decision making if you simply rely at the base of the pyramid. So let me just kind of quickly walk you through this again. 3 elements of the governance pyramid. Maximum governance outputs, shall we say, is at the top of the pyramid. Some formal approach to understanding risk and controls within your organization. Output of that, development of policies and procedures that could theoretically build out and build your insight. And then finally, the reliance on executive risk insurance, typically directors and officers. Maximum return if you're in control of that, if you're actually driving the questions, you're asking, what are we doing about risk? What's that level? But if you're more reliant on the base, really, I mean, where's the level of control that you have as a director within making the right decisions within that organization? From a corporate governance point of view, simply relying on information, even as you go through the pyramid, just relying on reports that come back to you, if you're just hovering in the middle of this pyramid, how much control do you really have in terms of righting the ship? And we're still, if you're simply waiting and you're letting sleeping dogs lie and you're not asking any questions at all and you're not abiding by your policies and procedures, what level of control do you really have as a director? That's what I'm talking about here. Any questions on this? My goal wasn't to scare you. That's his job. I'm just here to give you parameters. So, we're going to walk you through a case because you have now reached your destination. So I'm going to hand out a case, and I'm going to let Hein walk you through it. Hand that there. There you go. If you wouldn't mind, please.
I've changed the facts of the case to protect the innocent, but although it's a comparatively complicated fact pattern, it bears a passing resemblance to facts that actually happened. And I'll wait until you all have a copy of it.
See what's, I'll get whatever's left over. So. Does everybody have a copy of that?
Anybody not yet? Great.
Do we have leftovers?
So
Oh, there we go.
I've called the company Canadian Global, publicly traded. It has debt. It has covenants on the debt that require disclosure of material changes, and it's got significant D&O coverage. So you're a director of Canadian Global. It's got a project in Kosovo. The project is controversial. The greenies are all over it. You have a local lawyer. The local lawyer's job is to do community relations. Your CEO, it turns out, has pressed 50,000 euros into the lawyer's hands to do good things with. The local bookkeeper in Kosovo has been unable to extract from the lawyer any accounting of what's happened to the money. He might have stolen it. He might have bribed people with it. You just don't know. When the audit was done, all of this came to light. Something had to be done with it. So the company recorded the expense on the company books as an asset, and then wrote it off since it was not material. And in a financial sense, it was not material. The auditors gave a clean audit certificate on the strength of all of that. And both the CFO and the CEO being also a director, were aware of all of these facts. Now, until only a few years ago, this would not have been a very interesting problem, because until a few years ago, the US had a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but Canada didn't. But Canada, a few years ago, did enact a Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, and that act has bite. There have been so far, I think, 3 findings of guilt, 2 of them on pleas, guilty pleas by the corporation. One was Nico Resources, the other was Griffiths Energy. That set each of them back about $10 million. And the third was a fellow named, I can never remember his name, Nazir Karagar. He did not plead guilty. He fought it and was convicted. of trying to bribe Indian officials. No money changed hands, but he was convicted of conspiracy. The maximum penalty at that time was 5 years. The judge gave him 3. So there is a little bite if you find yourself on the wrong end of that statute. And so the question you as a director have to grapple with is, do you let sleeping dogs lie? You know, the years behind you, you have a clean audit certificate. Nobody outside of the company has made any noise about this. On the other hand, you know about it. What do you do? Do you let sleeping dogs lie? Or do you go after it and find out, was the money stolen? Was it used to grease palms? What happened? That's the question. And so who would like to lead off? I can start with some questions. Your loan agreement says if there is a material fact, you need to disclose it to the lender. Do you disclose to the lender? You're publicly traded if there is a material fact like the suspicion that your CEO might be guilty of a crime that might send him to jail. Is that something you need to disclose? Do I have any takers? Sir?
I'd say yes to all this. I'd go after it.
You'll go after it. Take the risk. Any contrary-minded? Sir?
The issue of one event is it may be one event. However, if management has done something like this, are there other practices that have not come to the attention of the board where effectively we cross some ethical issues with respect to governance of management and the trust of management? Has the review been thorough enough to ensure that they've gotten all the information passed? It would be alarming because it's sometimes hard to believe just one event like this.
You bet.
Yeah, I don't think there's any argument that you have to get to the bottom of the problem. The amount of money involved becomes absolutely immaterial. You could be in violation of Canadian statutes. You could be in violation of statutes in Kosovo, which could impede the business that you're trying to do there. And you could bring yourself up to the general distrust by the Canadian public as a public entity.
Yeah, you got a big reputational dog, and not just a reputational dog. If you don't do something about it, amongst the little downsides, you're now an accessory after the fact.
Correct.
You are yourself exposed to criminal consequences potentially. So,
But I can say that most boards that I've been involved in, and some large Canadian ones, will rumble their guts. They'll rumble their guts over whether or not they want to push the envelope and get to the bottom of it. And I can remember going back years ago with a telephone company in Canada that was involved in installing telephone systems in Saudi Arabia. Exactly the same thing happened, and of course, you're dealing with all sorts of issues with problem solvers in those countries, and of course, we have the recent circumstances going on with some of our very large construction companies.
SNC Leveland. So, okay, is there anyone who would say, hey, look, let sleeping dogs lie. This might just go away. Any takers? All right. Suppose you do push it. How do you go about it? What do you do? Sir?
Well, I think basically you have to take it to the board to get a problem
Mm-hmm.
and make board aware of what that problem is.
And then what does the board do? How does the board get its arms around it?
I think you have to now analyze all the follow-on effects, all the water. It's a whole series of waterfall effects because you pointed out whether it's government, whether it's your insurance, there are all those effects. So it becomes a bigger and bigger issue.
Can I make one suggestion? One of the problems you have when you report this on the board, to the board, is one of the culprits is a director. So what do you do about that? Does the special committee get representation, legal representation? Let me, maybe I can segue and fold in here a point that I meant to make and there was just never a comfortable opportunity. When you get the big crisis, right, it turns out that your Del Gracia and all the wonderful assay results that drove the stock from $4 market cap to $400 million market cap were based on samples that were salted, or your smelter blew up, or the Securities Commission has just given you in private a draft notice of hearing accusing your board of insider trading. When one of those ghastly events happens, typically what you need is a team to come to grips with it. And typically, nobody's ever thought of assembling such a team because it's not going to happen to us. It just doesn't happen that often. It's not worth it. You'd have to spend money. Why do it? If there's one takeaway I would hope you would have from this session is it's true that you can't predict what the mighty crisis is that's gonna hit you, but there's a reasonable chance that some crisis will. And at least some of the help that you need is not going to be tied to what the particular crisis is. Irrespective of what the crisis is, you are, I'm happy to say, going to need a lawyer. At least identify who that's going to be, make sure he's not conflicted, make sure he's available if you need him. You're going to need a communications person. And frankly, the communications person is more important, particularly in the early days, than the lawyer. You don't need to know what the crisis is to identify that person. And so what I'd recommend is if you make no other preparation for a crisis hitting you, identify the key skill sets you need and make sure they're readily available. And the reason I say it is, unfailingly, what happens is you get this horrible lull while you're trying to pull a team together. And the sooner you can hit things, and in particular, the sooner you can hit the press, which will be all over you, the better. The longer the silence before you make a response, the worse. And if you can't get top shelf communications advice and you get maybe third shelf communications advice, the outcome from that might not be pretty. The David Baineses of this world will cut you up. So if you do nothing else, get a team.
Good news is David's retired.
I know, I know. But he will find a successor. Someone will come in. I think I'm mildly surprised at how unanimous all of this was, but given how everyone has agreed you need to get to the bottom of it, I think that exhausts
Pretty much does.
that hypothetical.
So we're at the close, and fully recognizing every one of you has afforded us quite generously 2 hours of your time this morning. Thank you very much for your participation and your interest in the subject. Now, before we kind of close, definitely we want to throw the floor open to any specific questions, anything that by all means we'll be here as well to have more detailed discussions, but open floor kind of questions for Hein or myself. Yes?
So I'm in the nonprofit sector, and a lot of the examples you gave were from the profit sector, but I believe that a lot of it does translate quite a bit in terms of the law and the application to how we operate.
It does.
Okay.
Almost everything translates. The only good news in the not-for-profit sector is very often the stakes are small enough that people don't have fights. But still better to be careful.
Right. And one other comment on the not-for-profit, having I sit on a number of nonprofits as well. The formality is not as appropriate because not-for-profits tend, depending on the size and what you are, You can achieve many of what we've talked about in terms of the best practices, but you don't have to turn it into an overly egregious exercise. So often embedding it in day-to-day conversations is often the way to go on the nonprofit side. Okay? Any other questions or comments for us? You've been an extremely engaged group, so a few more minutes to put us on the spot. Has Hein sufficiently scared you? I'm trying to be the nice guy here. Okay, so what we'd like to do is obviously say thank you. Oh, sorry.
Just one thing, I've got mention about the video, and we're going to ask a few people now.
Oh, yes, okay. I think if any one of you is interested in providing any sort of on-camera feedback for us, please, by all means, see any of the individuals sort of standing in the back. It's very obviously important to us, but it's also important that this event is sort of archived from the purposes of look at around the room, look at who's here, look at who's represented. This is clearly a topic that is of interest. We have received a significant amount of interest, and all of you who've showed up, we greatly appreciate that. So if you would be so kind, if you're interested to provide us feedback, we are building out a promotional aspect for this on behalf of Stikeman and BFL, so we thank you for that in advance. Any other closing comments? Again, just to reiterate what's in your package and also what's in front of you, our token of appreciation for those of you who haven't sort of unwrapped your little gift that's at the front of the table, that's yours to take away. The packages, again, are prepared specifically for your industry sector. Some information with respect to the Stikeman capabilities as well as BFL capabilities, as well as some relevant industry information for you on the emerging sort of risk issues and tools available to you. And I've included actually a copy of the white paper that actually kicked off the whole concept of this GPS analogy for your leisurely reading pleasure on a rainy Tuesday morning. So, on behalf of Hein and myself, thank you again, everyone, for showing up. We appreciate it. Thanks for your support. Thank you, sir.
Well,
It's a pleasure.
that was pretty good fun. Thank you very much. Nice meeting you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, well, great show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, how are you, Ann?
Really
Good
great
to see you.
job.
Thank you.
In that last case scenario,
Yeah.
you won't have on a board everyone saying, let's pursue this. But the issue dilemma that maybe you want to put in that scenario is pressure.
Check 1, 2.
Not being able to reconcile which way. Not having a voice say,
Check. Yeah.
People saying we can't pursue it. What do you do then?
Check 1, 2. Check.
Well, not as a lawyer, on the board.
On the
to
board?
get that
As a
voice
director?
yeah.
Check 1, 2.
I
1,
think the
2,
only
3.
right answer is to pursue it.
I know.
If they will not pursue it,